Friends, before you start reading this story, do me one small favor. Subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. This story is one of profound struggle. It's about the final gasp of an entire empire, about how desperation itself becomes a weapon. I promise you won't regret it. And at the end, after reading, I'm waiting for each of you in the comments. Write what you felt when you finished. Your opinion is priceless. And now let's dive in. Ten rons for ons. Picture this scene. It stands before my eyes as if I were standing there myself, in a cold cellar, smelling the scent of fear and dust. Berlin, April 1945. Not just spring, but the death rattle of the thousand-year Reich, which had only weeks left to live. The air is thick with soot, smoke, and the Swedish smell of decay. Somewhere very close, a few blocks away, you can hear the volleys of Soviet Katyushas, a sound like the fabric of the universe tearing apart. This isn't just war, it's its final, most terrifying act. In the Neukölln district, on the ruins of what was recently a brewery smelling of hops and now smells of death, 17-year-old Hans is dragging the last, desperately heavy crate of cartridges into a basement. He is 17, only 17. At that age, I was preparing for final exams and dreaming of my first love. Hans is preparing for death. He is wearing a worn-out, ill-fitting Hitler Youth uniform. On his sleeve is an armband with the hated word Volkssturm, the militia, the people's assault. It sounds proud, right? But in reality, it's the last, desperate stroke in the painting of total collapse. In his hands is a rifle. But it's not the famous, reliable Mauser 98K that German soldiers carried across half of Europe. No, this is something else. The wooden stock is crude, unpolished, as if made in half an hour by a carpentry apprentice. The barrel is short, as if hastily cut down. And on the receiver are two letters, coldly stamped by the hand of some unknown prisoner. VG.2. Volkssturmgewehr, the people's rifle. Hans doesn't know that this rifle was assembled in the workshop of a former bicycle factory near Dresden. He doesn't know that its barrel was made from a discarded, worn-out barrel of an aircraft machine gun. He doesn't know that its parts were stamped from whatever was available, saving every gram of scarce steel. He only knows one thing. In a few hours, maybe minutes, they will come here. The Ivans will come. The Soviet assault infantry. Soldiers hardened in dozens of battles. Angry, merciless, avenging Stalingrad, their burned villages, their comrades. And Hans has only this rifle, and 10 rounds in the magazine, and 0 chance of survival. This scene is my artistic fiction. But scenes like this, Hanses like this, were repeated hundreds, thousands of times in the final weeks of the Third Reich's agony. And this rifle, this VG.2, became for me the brightest, most eerie symbol of systemic collapse. It's not just a weapon. It is materialized desperation. It is the last convulsive attempt of Nazi Germany to turn industrial ruin into a semblance of martial valor, passing off an engineering failure as a patriotic impulse. And today I want to tell you this story. The story of how this wonder weapon was born, how desperate orders clashed with harsh reality, and what this people ultimately held in their hands. This is not just a story about war. It's a story about what happens when technology and common sense are replaced by hysteria and propaganda. And believe me, this story has much more relevance to our world today than it might seem at first glance. The deathbed order, the birth of madness. To understand the phenomenon of the people's rifle, we need to go back to the autumn of 1944. The war was already irrevocably lost for Germany. After the Allied landings in Normandy and the monstrous losses in Operation Bagration on the Eastern Front, even the most stubborn generals understood catastrophe was inevitable. But a regime built on a mad ideology could not simply surrender. It was obliged to fight to the last German. On the 25th of September, 1944, Adolf Hitler signed his famous, one might say, deathbed decree on the creation of the Volkssturm, the people's militia. It was to include all men aged 16 to 60 who had not served in the army or had been demobilized for some reason. Imagine this flower of the nation, 16-year-old kids who had never smelled gunpowder, and 60-year-old grandfathers who still remembered the Kaiser and the trenches of the First World War. And so, the German military-industrial complex, which was already cracking at all seams under the blows of Allied aviation, was set a task bordering on pure madness: to arm up to 6 million people. Of these, by the most conservative estimates, at least 4 million needed rifles. 4 million. That's a colossal number. And what could the German industry offer them? Let's look at the numbers. They speak more eloquently than any words. In October 1944, all the factories of the Reich, including those working in underground bunkers, produced less than 200,000 Mauser and 98K carbines per month. This was the golden classic, reliable and accurate. But the stated demand of even the regular, professional Wehrmacht army was 300,000 rifles monthly. The army was missing a third of what it needed. And on top of that, another 4 million for the Volkssturm. Simply continuing production of the Mausers for the militiamen was economic and logistical suicide. Just one such rifle took about 12 to 15 hours of machine time, required high-quality grades of steel, and precise machining. Germany no longer had any of this. And then that desperate, improvisational gesture was born, which to me resembles the agony of a wounded beast: the Volkswehr program. It was initiated by the Sonderkommission Infanteriewaffen, Special Commission for Infantry Weapons, at the Ministry of Armaments of none other than Albert Speer, who was trying to miraculously sustain the war machine. The tasks were set with stunning cynicism and desperation. Minimum machine time. Essentially, assembly on your knees. Assembly in small workshops. Involve everything, from furniture factories to bicycle repair shops. This is called the decentralization of agony. Strict economy of scarce materials. Steel, only where it's a matter of life and death. For the rest, whatever we find. And most importantly, the use of the existing 7.92 by 57 millimeters cartridge. This was an important but strange point. On one hand, the ammunition logistics hadn't collapsed yet. On the other, this cartridge was too powerful for primitive and light rifles, making them uncomfortable and inaccurate to shoot. One detail still amazes me, perfectly characterizing this whole mess. For the barrels of these people's rifles, they planned to use discarded barrels from Luftwaffe aircraft machine guns, MG-15, MG-17, and MG-81. Can you imagine? The once proud German Air Force, the Sky Führer, could no longer take to the skies due to a lack of fuel and pilots, and its spent metal was being used for militia rifle barrels. Someone at the time later quipped bitterly, "It was the total mobilization of waste." In my opinion, you can't put it more accurately. The competition of ghosts. Trials in Dobeln. On the 28th of October, 1944, something happened at the Dobeln test range that can hardly be called ordinary weapons testing. It was more like a review of homemade gadgets, but gadgets on which the lives of thousands of people depended. Picture this: a cold autumn day, officials from the ministry, engineers with haggard faces. And on the tables, prototypes from 5 companies that were still trying to produce something in this hell: Appel, Deutsche Industriewerke, Irma, Gustloff Werke, and the legendary Mauser itself. The favorite from the start was the model from Deutsche Industriewerke, an obscenely simple rifle with a bolt action. But even this simplicity required improvements. And there was no time left for improvements. A week later, on the 4th of November, the second round began. Other whales of German industry joined this strange competition: Walther, Bergmann, Rheinmetall Borsig, and Rockling Eisenhundi Stahlwerk. The winner was ultimately declared to be the VG.1 model from Walther. It was slightly more complex, but used a detachable magazine from the self-loading G43/K43 rifle holding 10 rounds. It would seem, here it is, the standard. Take it and put it into production. But no, this is where the most telling managerial chaos begins. Instead of standardizing one best model, the leadership made an absurd, unprecedented decision to launch 5 different models into mass production simultaneously. 5. Imagine the level of desperation and disorganization at the top required to make such a decision. Each Gauleiter, each district leader, tried to snatch his piece of the military order for local factories to show his loyalty to the Führer. Every industrialist tried to survive by getting a government contract. Instead of the desperately needed unification, a real technical zoo was created under the general name Volkssturm. It was chaos elevated to the rank of state policy, the menagerie of desperation. From VG.1 to VK.98. Let's walk through this menagerie and take a close look at what was handed to the German people as a weapon of vengeance. WWII, Volkssturm, the most mass-produced of all the people's rifles, and the most varied. It was produced, according to various sources, at 18 different enterprises. Think about that number. Among them were not only arms factories, but also furniture factories and repair shops. Imagine a carpenter who yesterday was making stools, today trying to assemble a combat rifle. Hence the wild variability. One VG.1 rifle could weigh 3 kilograms, 300 grams, while another, already 3 kilograms, 770 grams. The barrel length fluctuated from 400 to 590 millimeters. What kind of aiming, what kind of accuracy could we be talking about? A soldier must get used to his weapon, feel it. Here, every specimen was unique, like a snowflake. Sighting range, a laughable 1 to 200 meters. Essentially, this is a weapon for shooting in the direction of the enemy. WWII, Sprivark, more standardized, but no less primitive. Its length was 1,068 millimeters, the barrel about 500. But the main thing was its practical rate of fire, about 10 rounds per minute. I did the math on purpose. Imagine a Soviet soldier with a PPSH submachine gun, which has a rate of fire of about 1,000 rounds per minute, a 71-rounder magazine. And against him, Hans, who can manage to fire one, at best 2 shots before being covered by a hail of lead. In total, about 16 to 18,000 such rifles were produced. The irony of fate. Some of them were assembled at the Shisho shipyard in Elbing, an enterprise that had previously built torpedo boats. From ocean waves to Berlin basements, such was the path of this rifle, and of all Germany. WWII, Rheinmetall. Now, this is where it gets interesting and very sad. There were 2 versions of the VG.3. The first, for the standard powerful 7.92 by 57 millimeters cartridge, proved unsuccessful and failed the tests. But the second one was for the intermediate 7.92 by 33 millimeters cartridge and used a detachable magazine from the STG-44 assault rifle. Length, only 880 millimeters. Weight, 3 kilograms, 120 grams. This was no longer a rifle, but something like a carbine, light, and potentially effective in close combat. But only 3 to 50 units were produced. Why? Because it was an attempt to integrate people's weapons into a new, promising tactical paradigm. But this attempt was several years too late. The STG-44, a revolutionary assault rifle, had fought its way through with great difficulty. Conservative generals did not accept it. And as for putting its simplified version into mass production for the militia, it was out of the question. A mischance. The ghost of what could have been, if not for stupid stubbornness and industrial collapse. VG.4, Mauser, and VG.5/VK.98, Steyr. The VG.4 from Mauser remained an experimental model. Fewer than 10 were made. And the VK.98 is a whole different story. Its full name is Volkssturmgewehr 98. Essentially, it was a wildly simplified Mauser 98K. And here we approach the peak of this engineering cynicism. Some of these rifles did not even have a magazine. Yes, you heard that right. The shooter had to load cartridges into the chamber one by one, like a hunting rifle from the times of the Wild West. Imagine that in an urban battle against a Soviet soldier with a semi-automatic SVT rifle or a PPSH. That's not even laughable, it's tragic. Sighting range, 1 to 150 meters. About 10,000 of these masterpieces were produced. The semi-automatic agony. Gustloff Volkssturmgewehr. And finally, the most famous, one might say star representative of this family. The Gustloff Volkssturmgewehr, sometimes called VG.1-5. This was the only semi-automatic model in this program. It was developed by engineer Karl Barnitzk. The weapon used that very promising intermediate 7.92 by 33 mm cartridge and 30-round magazines from the STG-44. Sound great, right? A semi-automatic, large magazine, but the devil, as always, is in the details. This rifle operated on an exotic and not very reliable principle of a delayed blowback with gas retardation. And most importantly, the quality. The receivers were stamped from thin, tin can-like steel. The bolts often jammed after a few shots. Production began only in January 1945 at the Gustloff Werke factories in Weimar. They produced, according to various estimates, from 10 to 24,700 units. And this was perhaps the only model that could, at least theoretically, somehow counter the automatic weapons of the Allies in urban combat. But theory was shattered by the reality of defects, haste, and general collapse. A verdict, not a weapon. So what was the result? What was the outcome of this giant, convulsive program? The numbers speak for themselves again. Official statistics for January-March 1945, the last 3 months of the war, indicate 53,033 Volksgewehr of all types produced. Researchers like Darren Weaver estimate total production at 76 to 88,000 pieces. But none of these figures even came close to the target of 100,000 rifles per month. Most of these rifles never reached the front. They rotted in warehouses, were destroyed by bombings, or became trophies of Soviet and American soldiers. Interestingly, the Red Army men practically did not use captured Volksgewehr. Their reliability was too low. But Western collectors later appreciated them as rare artifacts, material evidence of the Third Reich's agony. Weapons of desperation is not just a pretty phrase, it's an accurate definition. The Volksgewehr series was never a real combat solution. It was a purely political gesture. A gesture designed to create the illusion that the entire nation, from young to old, had risen to fight. That even in the hands of an old man and a child, there was a weapon. But in reality, when a Volkssturm fighter first picked up a VG.2, he was not picking up a weapon of vengeance. He was picking up his death sentence, signed by madmen in Berlin and executed by Soviet soldiers on the streets of his hometown. And in this story, for me, lies a bitter but very important irony. It was this attempt at mass, total simplification, undertaken in the death throes of the regime, that indirectly confirmed the correctness of those few sober minds who, as early as 1942, had insisted on switching to an intermediate cartridge and automatic weapons. The STG-44 was a breakthrough. It pointed the way to the future, a path that the whole world would follow after the war, including the famous AK-47. And the Volksgewehr was its ugly, pathetic, caricatured shadow. One of them changed the future of small arms for decades to come. The other only reminded us that in technology, in industry, in state governance, desperation and hysteria can never replace competence, common sense, and sober calculation. This story is not just a history lesson. It is a warning for all time. So, our story about the weapon of desperation has come to an end. I hope it touched a nerve with you, as it once did with me. This story was worth telling, and now I'm really looking forward to your feedback. Please write in the comments. What did you feel when you imagined that very Hans in the basement? Did this story seem instructive to you? And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video if you found it interesting. It's the best support for me to continue finding and telling you such poignant stories from our past. Thank you for staying with me until the end.